This video is part one of a two-part series on inflation. I was able to talk to a well-known economist named Fred Bergsten. He's known for holding prestigious job positions such as being an assistant for international economic affairs to Henry Kissinger at the National Security Council and being assistant secretary for international affairs at the U.S. Treasury Department. He's also well known for being involved in the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace during 1981. He also founded the Institute for International Economics in that same year. Throughout his career, he's written over 40 books. Notably, Mr. Bergsten is a Farmington alum, having graduated in 1957. What are some factors that cause inflation?
Well, there are two main factors on the two sides of the economy, supply and demand. Demand pressures like consumer demand or investment expand excessively. You can get upward pressure on prices. Likewise, if there are shortfalls on the supply side, a big decline in energy production, or like now, disruption in supply chains for things like semiconductor chips, then you wind up with shortages of product which drive prices up. So it's always the combination of the two factors. Policy affects it. If monetary policy in particular is too loose and the central bank is pumping out excessive amounts of money, then you can also get inflationary pressure. Too much money chasing too few goods is the way it's sometimes put. Likewise, the government can contribute to excessive demand by running big budget deficit, excessive tax cuts, big spending increases. Any of those factors can add to the inflation picture, but it's always some combination of those two things, excess demand and falling supplies. The government has a lot of tools to deal with inflation. The most important is really held not by the government per se, but by the Federal Reserve. I'm not a monetarist, and I don't think that monetary conditions are the primary determinant of inflation in all cases. But in terms of policy tools, the most effective is monetary policy. The ability of the Federal Reserve to ease money through reducing interest rates or pumping money into the economy can increase inflation. And conversely, when inflation is rising excessively, like now, the Fed has to take the punch bowl away before the party starts, as is frequently said, meaning they need to raise interest rates, cut back on the expansion of the money supply. In the current case, cut back on their quantitative easing, their purchases of financial market assets. Those are the most effective means. The government can reduce demand by tightening fiscal policy, but the problem is that usually takes quite a while, particularly in our system, where you have to get agreement between the two parties in the Congress, between the White House and the Congress, before you can make significant changes in fiscal policy. But over time, reducing the budget deficits, even moving into surplus, as was done in the early 2000s, can reduce inflation. Now, on top of that, the government has a whole bunch of microeconomic things it can do that have some modest effect on inflation. It can try to tighten antitrust regulation to reduce the power of monopolies in the markets and thereby increase competition. And it can liberalize product markets, for example, by eliminating tariffs and other import controls that reduces prices directly and therefore reduces inflation. So there are lots of things the government can do at a sector-specific level, but the big thing are the Fed on monetary policy and, with a considerable lag, the government with fiscal policy. Like anything in economics, there are pluses and minuses to every phenomenon. Mild inflation can sometimes help stimulate growth, but excessive inflation, meaning inflation that distorts decision makers' economic decisions on consumption, on private investment. If inflation becomes excessive, it can distort the economy and even derail it if it forces the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates dramatically and bring on a recession. In fact, most U.S. recessions in the post-war period have been caused by exactly that phenomenon. Inflation gets moving too fast to be acceptable to the public, distorts economic decisions, distorts income distribution, and therefore the Federal Reserve has to tighten to bring things back into some kind of balance or equilibrium. And if it moves too little, if it moves too late or too much, which it may have to because it's delayed, then you can get a recession. And then that's been the story in most of the post-war period. So a little inflation may be a good thing, or at least acceptable, but excessive inflation, traditionally defined as anything above 4%, 4 or 5%, that can be very unfavorable.